All right, find a comfortable spot. Let your shoulders relax and let the noise of the day begin to fade away. We're going on a little trip tonight, not through the cosmos to distant stars, but back in time to a single incredible moment in our own history. We're going to tell the story of the moon landing. But this won't be like a history class documentary with loud music and dramatic cuts. Think of it more as a quiet, late-night story, a gentle recollection of one of the most audacious, brilliant, and downright strange things humanity has ever done. We'll explore the little details, the human moments, and the mind-boggling technology, all as a nice, slow pace. Our story begins not with a rocket, but with an idea. It was the early 1960s, a time of great tension and competition in the world, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry extended into space, a new and mysterious frontier. After the Soviets achieved early successes like launching the first satellite and sending the first human into orbit, a young American president, John F. Kennedy, decided to set a goal so ambitious it seemed almost impossible. In 1961, he stood before a crowd and proposed that America should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. This wasn't just a casual suggestion. It became a national mission, and the scale of the effort was simply colossal. This wasn't the work of a few dozen brilliant scientists in a lab. To achieve this goal, it took the coordinated effort of over 400,000 people from all across the country: engineers, technicians, mathematicians, programmers, doctors, and seamstresses who hand-wove the computer memory. It was an undertaking on the scale of a major war, but its goal was one of peaceful exploration. It was a testament to what can be achieved when a huge number of people all focus their energy on a single, incredible dream.
But to get to the moon, you first need a way to leave the Earth. And not just leave it, but escape its gravitational pull completely. For that, you need a rocket. And the Apollo program didn't just need any rocket. It needed the biggest, most powerful machine ever built by humankind. The result was the Saturn V. It's hard to properly convey the sheer scale of the Saturn V. It remains, to this day, the tallest, heaviest, and most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. It stood 111 meters, or 363 feet tall. That's taller than the Statue of Liberty, taller than a 36-story building. It was so enormous, the only place big enough to assemble it was a specially constructed building at the Kennedy Space Center, the Vehicle Assembly Building, which is still one of the largest buildings in the world by volume. The real power, though, was in its engines. The first stage of the rocket, the part that did the initial heavy lifting, was powered by 5 colossal F1 engines. A single one of these engines had more raw power than all 3 of the Space Shuttle's main engines combined. So for launch, it was like having 5 Space Shuttle launches happening all at once. The sound it produced was less a noise and more a physical force. It didn't just rattle windows. The acoustic shock waves were so powerful they could literally shake the ground, bounce off the clouds, and be felt in the chests of observers standing miles away. The rocket was so massive and burned through fuel so quickly, it was basically a controlled explosion. In the first 2.5 minutes of flight, it would lift the entire spacecraft to an altitude of over 60 kilometers and a speed of nearly 10,000 kilometers per hour, all before the first stage dropped away into the ocean. The Saturn V was a true monster, a beautiful, brilliant beast of controlled power.
The rocket itself was made up of 3 separate parts, or stages, that would fire one after another to push the payload farther and faster. After the first stage dropped away, the second stage would fire, pushing the astronauts almost into orbit. Then the third stage would fire briefly to put them in a stable parking orbit around the Earth, before firing again for a full 6 minutes to blast them out of Earth's orbit and on their way to the Moon. This final burn was called the translunar injection. Sitting right at the very top of this giant stack of explosives was the spacecraft itself, the part where the astronauts would live and work. This also came in 2 main parts. The first was the Apollo Command Module. This was the mothership, and it was given the call sign Columbia for the Apollo 11 mission. It was a cone-shaped capsule that served as the main living quarters and command center for the 3-man crew for most of the 8-day mission. It was the only part of the entire spacecraft that would make the full journey to the Moon and back to Earth. Attached to it and tucked away during the initial journey was the second, much stranger-looking craft, the lunar module, nicknamed the Eagle. The Eagle was a marvel of engineering, a fragile, spindly, insect-like machine with one and only one purpose: to land 2 astronauts on the Moon and get them back up to the command module. It was the first crewed vehicle designed to fly only in the vacuum of space. It had no heat shield and wasn't at all aerodynamic because it never had to fly through an atmosphere. To save weight, its walls were incredibly thin. In some places, the aluminum skin of the lunar module was so thin you could have easily poked a screwdriver right through it. The astronauts had to be very careful moving around inside. It was a delicate, specialized machine built for a world with no air.
Now, navigating this complex machinery across 250,000 miles of empty space required a brain. And the brain of the Apollo spacecraft was the Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC. In an age where we all carry supercomputers in our pockets, it's almost comical to look back at the AGC's specifications. It was one of the very first computers to use a revolutionary new technology called integrated circuits, which are the basis of all modern electronics. But by today's standards, its power was minuscule. The AGC had only 2 kilobytes of RAM, the memory it uses for active calculations. For comparison, a single low-resolution photo on your phone today takes up thousands of times more space than that. For its permanent memory, the programs that told it how to fly, it had just 36 kilobytes. This wasn't stored on a hard drive, but was literally woven by hand into ropes of wires and magnetic cores by female factory workers. It was called core rope memory, and it was unchangeable. The programming had to be perfect before it was physically woven. A team at MIT, led by a brilliant computer scientist named Margaret Hamilton, was responsible for writing this groundbreaking software. They had to invent the very principles of modern software engineering as they went along, creating programs that were incredibly robust and reliable. They planned for every contingency, a fact that would become critically important during the landing itself. The AGC was a testament to doing more with less, a tiny digital brain guiding a giant metal machine on the most ambitious journey ever undertaken. Of course, a machine, no matter how brilliant, is nothing without its crew. And for the historic Apollo 11 mission, that crew was a team of 3 exceptionally skilled and very different men. The commander was Neil Armstrong.
Neil Armstrong was a civilian, a former test pilot who was known for his quiet, calm demeanor and his incredible engineering mind. He wasn't a flashy, larger-than-life character. He was a focused, humble professional who saw the mission as a complex engineering problem to be solved. He was chosen to be the first to step on the moon, largely because of this calm personality. NASA officials figured he was the best person to handle the immense pressure and historical weight of that moment. The second crew member, the pilot of the lunar module, was Buzz Aldrin. Aldrin was a brilliant academic with a doctorate in astronautics from MIT. His doctoral thesis was on orbital rendezvous, the very techniques that would be crucial for docking the spacecraft in lunar orbit. He was meticulous, intellectual, and deeply passionate about the technical details of the mission. While Armstrong was the cool-headed pilot, Aldrin was the scientific mind, responsible for many of the procedures that would make the landing a success. The third member of the crew, and the one sometimes forgotten, was Michael Collins. His job was to be the pilot of the command module, Columbia. He would not get to walk on the moon. While Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface in the Eagle, Collins would remain in orbit, circling the moon alone, waiting for their return. It was a vital and incredibly demanding role. He had to be prepared to fly the entire mission home by himself if something went wrong on the surface. He was known for his sharp wit and eloquent, almost poetic way of looking at the mission, making him the perfect chronicler of the journey. Together, these 3 men formed the perfect team, each bringing a unique skill set and personality to the mission. Their training was, as you can imagine, grueling. They spent years in simulators, practicing every moment of the mission over and over again until it was second nature. Of course, a machine, no matter how brilliant, is nothing without its crew. And for the historic Apollo 11 mission, that crew was a team of 3 exceptionally skilled and very different men. The commander was Neil Armstrong.
Neil Armstrong was a civilian, a former test pilot, who was known for his quiet, calm demeanor and his incredible engineering mind. He wasn't a flashy, larger-than-life character. He was a focused, humble professional who saw the mission as a complex engineering problem to be solved. He was chosen to be the first to step on the moon largely because of this calm personality. NASA officials figured he was the best person to handle the immense pressure and historical weight of that moment. The second crew member, the pilot of the lunar module, was Buzz Aldrin. Aldrin was a brilliant academic with a doctorate in astronautics from MIT. His doctoral thesis was on orbital rendezvous, the very techniques that would be crucial for docking the spacecraft in lunar orbit. He was meticulous, intellectual, and deeply passionate about the technical details of the mission. While Armstrong was the cool-headed pilot, Aldrin was the scientific mind, responsible for many of the procedures that would make the landing a success. The third member of the crew, and the one sometimes forgotten, was Michael Collins. His job was to be the pilot of the command module, Columbia. He would not get to walk on the moon. While Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface in the Eagle, Collins would remain in orbit, circling the moon alone, waiting for their return. It was a vital and incredibly demanding role. He had to be prepared to fly the entire mission home by himself if something went wrong on the surface. He was known for his sharp wit and eloquent, almost poetic way of looking at the mission, making him the perfect chronicler of the journey. Together, these three men formed the perfect team, each bringing a unique skill set and personality to the mission. Their training was, as you can imagine, grueling. They spent years in simulators, practicing every moment of the mission over and over again until it was second nature.
The simulators they used were state-of-the-art for the 1960s, but the most crucial training was for the trickiest part of the entire mission, landing the lunar module. The LM didn't fly like a plane or a helicopter. It flew only in a vacuum, controlled by multiple thruster rockets. To practice this, NASA developed a bizarre and incredibly dangerous machine called the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, or LLTV. The astronauts nicknamed it the Flying Bedstead because that's frankly what it looked like, a tangled mess of pipes and thrusters with a small platform for the pilot. It was designed to simulate the flight characteristics of the LM in Earth's gravity by using a downward-facing jet engine to counteract 5/6 of its own weight, while the astronaut used rocket thrusters to control the rest. The LLTV was notoriously difficult and dangerous to fly. In fact, Neil Armstrong, a man considered one of the best pilots in the world, had a near-fatal accident during a training flight. In 1968, his LLTV malfunctioned, and he was forced to eject just seconds before it crashed and exploded in a massive fireball. He calmly floated down in his parachute, walked back to his office, and quietly did paperwork for the rest of the day. It was a testament to his cool-headed nature, the very quality that made him perfect for the mission. The training wasn't all about flying either. A huge part of the Apollo missions was science. The astronauts had to become proficient field geologists. They took extensive training trips to places on Earth that resembled the lunar landscape, like volcanic craters in Arizona and the desolate, rocky terrain of Iceland. They were taught by leading geologists how to identify different types of rocks and how to describe a landscape accurately. They needed to know what to look for and what samples would be most valuable to bring back to Earth. This was, after all, humanity's first and only chance to do geology on another world. They also had to get used to working in their bulky spacesuits. The Apollo A7L spacesuit was a masterpiece of engineering, a personalized, wearable spacecraft. Each suit was custom-made for the astronaut and consisted of 21 layers of different materials designed to protect them from the vacuum of space, extreme temperatures, and micrometeoroid impacts. But they were also cumbersome and difficult to move in, and the astronauts spent countless hours practicing their tasks in the suits, both in giant vacuum chambers and underwater in a large pool to simulate a low-gravity environment. Every single movement, from picking up a rock to setting up an experiment, had to be choreographed and rehearsed endlessly. And then there were the more mundane aspects of living in a tiny metal can for 8 days. The food, for example, was a long way from gourmet. Most of it was freeze-dried and had to be rehydrated with a water gun. It came in plastic pouches, and a lot of it was in the form of cubes or pastes. While it provided the necessary nutrition, it wasn't exactly delicious. The first meal eaten on the surface of the moon, by the way, was roast turkey, according to the mission plan, though Aldrin recalls having bacon squares. Finally, after years of preparation, the day arrived. July 16th, 1969. The crew, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, woke up early for a traditional pre-launch breakfast of steak and eggs. They suited up, took the slow elevator ride to the top of the towering Saturn V rocket, and strapped themselves into their seats in the Columbia command module. Below them was a 36-story machine filled with over 1 million gallons of highly explosive fuel. An estimated 1 million people had gathered on the beaches and roads around the Kennedy Space Center to watch. The whole world was holding its collective breath. At 9:32 a.m., the 5 giant F-1 engines ignited, and the Saturn V began to climb. Slowly at first, and then with astonishing, ground-shaking force. The launch was an intense and violent experience for the astronauts inside. While it looked graceful from the outside, they were being subjected to immense G-forces and violent vibrations. Buzz Aldrin described it as a jerky, shaky ride, not at all smooth. But everything was working perfectly. The different stages of the Saturn V fired and separated exactly as planned. Within just 12 minutes, the crew of Apollo 11 were in a stable orbit around the Earth, floating in weightlessness. Their journey had truly begun. After circling the Earth 1.5 times to check that all their systems were working correctly, it was time for the next big step. Mission Control in Houston gave them the famous call, "Apollo 11, you are go for TLI." That stood for translunar injection. The third stage of the Saturn V fired again, burning for 6 long minutes, accelerating the spacecraft to a speed of nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, fast enough to escape Earth's gravity and begin the long coast to the moon. This was the moment they truly left home. The trip to the moon would take about 3 days, and for most of that time, it was a relatively quiet and calm journey. The spacecraft was in what was called a passive thermal control mode, better known as the barbecue roll. It rotated slowly along its axis, like a chicken on a spit, to make sure one side didn't get too hot from the constant sunlight, while the other side froze. During this long coast, the astronauts had time to monitor their systems, perform navigation checks, and simply look out the window. One of the most profound experiences for all the Apollo astronauts was seeing the Earth shrink behind them. It went from being the ground beneath their feet to a giant curved horizon, and finally to a small, beautiful, fragile-looking blue and white marble hanging in the blackness of space. It was a view that no human had ever seen before their generation, a perspective that profoundly changed our understanding of our place in the universe. After about 3 days of coasting through space, Apollo 11 finally arrived at its destination. They flew behind the moon, losing radio contact with Earth for the first time. During this period of silence, they fired their main engine to slow down and allow themselves to be captured by the moon's gravity, officially entering lunar orbit. Now began one of the most critical and busiest phases of the mission. Armstrong and Aldrin moved from the command module Columbia into the lunar module, the Eagle. They went through a long checklist of procedures, powering up the lander and making sure every system was ready for the descent. After separating from Columbia, Michael Collins gave the Eagle a visual inspection, making sure its landing gear had deployed correctly. He famously said, "You have a beautiful machine, Eagle." He then moved Columbia a safe distance away and began his long, lonely vigil. As Collins orbited, Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for the final, most dangerous part of the journey, the powered descent to the lunar surface. They fired the Eagle's descent engine to begin braking, starting their fall out of orbit. At first, they were flying horizontally, face down, so they could see the lunar landscape rushing by beneath them. Then, in a maneuver called the pitch over, they rotated the Eagle into a feet-first upright position, so they could see their landing site for the first time. And that's when the problems started. As they got closer to the surface, a series of alarms suddenly went off inside the cockpit. The computer was displaying error codes, 1202 and 1201. The astronauts had never seen these alarms in the simulator. For a moment, it seemed like they might have to abort the mission just as they were about to land. Back in Houston, a young flight controller named Steve Bales had to make a split-second decision.
The 1202 alarm meant the computer was overloaded. It was being asked to do too much work at once. But thanks to the brilliant, forward-thinking software design by Margaret Hamilton's team, the computer was programmed to handle this. It was designed to recognize that some tasks were more important than others. When overloaded, it would automatically ignore the low-priority tasks and focus only on the essential ones, like steering the lander. Flight controller Steve Bales, remembering this from a training session, made the calm but critical call: go. He told the crew to proceed with the landing, trusting the computer's design. The alarms were due to the rendezvous radar being switched on, which wasn't needed for landing and was feeding the computer extra, unnecessary data. But the challenges weren't over. As Armstrong looked out his window, he realized the computer was taking them down into a bad spot. Their target landing zone was on the edge of a large, steep-walled crater, littered with big boulders. It was not a safe place to land. So, with the alarms still flashing, he did what any good pilot would do. He took control. He switched the computer to a semi-manual mode and began flying the Eagle horizontally, skimming over the crater, searching for a clear, safe spot to touch down. This used up a lot of precious fuel. Back in Houston, Mission Control was calling out the remaining fuel levels, and the numbers were getting dangerously low. 60 seconds. 30 seconds.
A light came on in the cockpit, the low fuel warning, meaning they had less than 2 minutes of hovering time left. If they didn't land before that ran out, they would have to abort. With just a few seconds of fuel to spare, Armstrong finally found a smooth patch of ground. He gently set the Eagle down on the lunar surface. One of the landing probes touched the ground and a blue light came on. Aldrin called out, "Contact light." Armstrong shut down the engine. There was a moment of silence. Then Armstrong's voice came through, calm as ever, to a breathless world. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed."
In mission control in Houston, a wave of relief and pure joy washed over the room. For a moment, the flight controllers, who had been laser-focused and unflappable, broke into cheers and applause. But for the crew on the moon, the work wasn't over. Armstrong's heart rate, which had peaked at 150 beats per minute during the tense final moments of the landing, began to settle. They immediately began a series of checks and procedures to configure the Eagle for its stay on the moon, and crucially, to prepare it for a potential emergency liftoff in case something went wrong. The original flight plan called for the astronauts to have a 5-hour sleep period at this point before they even attempted to step outside. They had been awake for a long time and were running on adrenaline. But inside the cramped lunar module, resting on another world for the first time in human history, the idea of going to sleep was absurd. They were far too excited. They argued their case with Houston, saying they felt fine and wanted to get on with the main event, the moonwalk, or EVA for extravehicular activity. Mission Control agreed. The sleep period was pushed to after the moonwalk. So they began the long and complicated process of getting ready to go outside. This was no simple task. It took them over 2 hours just to get into their bulky spacesuits and backpacks, which contained their life support systems. The inside of the lunar module was incredibly cramped, not much bigger than 2 telephone booths pushed together. Getting suited up in there was a slow, awkward, and difficult gymnastics exercise. Once they were suited up, they had to slowly depressurize the cabin, letting all the precious oxygen out into the vacuum of space until the pressure inside matched the pressure outside. 0. Finally, after hours of preparation, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the Eagle.
Armstrong slowly and carefully backed out of the small triangular hatch and onto a small platform they called the porch. He pulled a cord and a camera mounted on the lander switched on, broadcasting a grainy black and white, almost ghostly image to an estimated 650 million people watching on Earth. He then began his slow descent down the 9-rung ladder. As he reached the bottom rung, he paused. He described the surface from his vantage point, saying the lander's feet had only sunk in an inch or two into the fine powder. Then, at 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong placed his left boot down onto the surface of the moon. He had done it. Humanity had done it. A few moments later, his voice crackled over the radio with the immortal words he had prepared. "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." There has been some debate over the years about whether he said "for a man" or just "for man." Armstrong always maintained he intended to say "for a man," but the A was lost in the static of the transmission. Either way, the meaning was clear to everyone watching. His first impression of the lunar surface was that the soil was a fine, talc-like powder. He reported that it was easy to move around in, less slippery than he had expected. A bit later, when Buzz Aldrin joined him on the surface, they would both comment on the strange and distinct smell of the moon dust that got tracked back into the lander. After being exposed to the oxygen in the cabin, the dust gave off a scent they described as being like spent gunpowder or wet ashes from a fireplace. It was the smell of another world.
After taking his first tentative steps, Armstrong's initial task was to collect a contingency sample. This was a small bag of lunar soil he collected right away, just in case the mission had to be aborted suddenly. This would ensure that, no matter what happened, they would bring a piece of the moon back to Earth. Soon after, Buzz Aldrin made his way down the ladder to join him, becoming the second human to walk on the moon. He was mesmerized by the view, which he described in his own more technical terms as magnificent desolation. The two astronauts then got to work. One of their first, most symbolic tasks was to plant the American flag. This turned out to be surprisingly difficult. They struggled to push the flagpole deep enough into the hard lunar soil. They only managed to get it in a couple of inches. They also had to use a small telescoping horizontal rod to make the flag look like it was flying, since there is no wind on the moon to make it wave. Next, they set up the scientific experiments. This was the early Apollo Scientific Experiment Package, or ESEP. It included a device to collect particles from the solar wind and a passive seismic detector to listen for moonquakes and learn about the moon's interior structure. But perhaps the most enduring experiment was the laser-ranging retroreflector. This is essentially a sophisticated mirror designed to reflect laser beams fired from Earth directly back to their point of origin. By precisely timing how long it takes for the laser pulse to make the round trip, scientists can measure the distance between the Earth and the Moon with incredible millimeter-level precision. This experiment is amazingly still in use today, and it's how we know for sure that the Moon is slowly drifting away from us.
During their time on the surface, Armstrong and Aldrin acted as geologists, gathering rock and soil samples to bring back home. They collected about 21.5 kilograms or 47.5 pounds of lunar material. These rocks would prove to be a scientific treasure trove, completely revolutionizing our understanding of the Moon's age, origin, and history. In the middle of their moonwalk, they received a special message. It was a telephone call from the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, speaking to them from the Oval Office. He called it the most historic phone call ever made from the White House, congratulating them on behalf of the American people and the entire world. While on the surface, Buzz Aldrin, a devoutly religious man, also took a few moments for a private ceremony.
Before the mission, he had arranged to take a small communion kit with him. He poured a small amount of wine and consumed a wafer, becoming the first and only person to perform a Christian communion ceremony on the moon. He did this privately, only mentioning it briefly over the radio without going into detail, as NASA was trying to avoid overt religious displays after a previous controversy. The entire moonwalk lasted about 2.5 hours. After packing up their rock boxes and experiments, they climbed back up the ladder into the safety of the Eagle, their suits covered in the fine abrasive gray dust of the lunar surface. They had successfully completed all their objectives. But while all this incredible history was being made on the surface, we mustn't forget the third member of the crew, Michael Collins, who was having his own, very different but equally profound experience, all alone, high above them.
As Armstrong and Aldrin were making history, Michael Collins was orbiting the moon in the command module Columbia. For the entire duration of the moonwalk, he was their lifeline, their only ride home. If the Eagle's ascent engine failed to fire, there would be absolutely no way to rescue them. Collins would have to make the lonely journey back to Earth by himself. He later wrote that this was his single greatest fear. During his orbits, Collins was one of the busiest men on the mission, constantly monitoring systems, communicating with Houston, and tracking the position of the Eagle on the surface. But for 48 minutes of every 2-hour orbit, as Columbia passed over the far side of the moon, he was completely and utterly alone. He was cut off from all radio contact with Houston, with the Eagle, with every single other human being in the universe. He was, at those moments, the loneliest human in history. He later described this experience not as frightening, but as peaceful. He felt a sense of calm, even exultation in his solitary orbit. He was keenly aware of the historic events unfolding below him, but he was also the sole guardian of the mission's return leg. He had a small list of 18 different emergency procedures he might have to perform if the Eagle had to abort its landing at various stages. Thankfully, he never had to use any of them. He was a vital and often unsung hero of the mission. He kept a perfect vigil, waiting for his crewmates to return from the surface. After a much-needed, though reportedly very cold, sleep period inside the Eagle, it was time for Armstrong and Aldrin to leave. They prepared for the most critical moment of the mission after the landing, the ascent. To save weight for the journey home, they threw everything they didn't need out onto the lunar surface. This included their life support backpacks, their boots, and even bags of human waste. But while all this incredible history was being made on the surface, we mustn't forget the third member of the crew, Michael Collins, who was having his own, very different but equally profound experience, all alone, high above them.
As Armstrong and Aldrin were making history, Michael Collins was orbiting the moon in the command module Columbia. For the entire duration of the moonwalk, he was their lifeline, their only ride home. If the Eagle's ascent engine failed to fire, there would be absolutely no way to rescue them. Collins would have to make the lonely journey back to Earth by himself. He later wrote that this was his single greatest fear. During his orbits, Collins was one of the busiest men on the mission, constantly monitoring systems, communicating with Houston, and tracking the position of the Eagle on the surface. But for 48 minutes of every 2-hour orbit, as Columbia passed over the far side of the Moon, he was completely and utterly alone. He was cut off from all radio contact with Houston, with the Eagle, with every single other human being in the universe. He was, at those moments, the loneliest human in history. He later described this experience not as frightening, but as peaceful. He felt a sense of calm, even exultation in his solitary orbit. He was keenly aware of the historic events unfolding below him, but he was the sole guardian of the mission's return leg. He had a small list of 18 different emergency procedures he might have to perform if the Eagle had to abort its landing at various stages. Thankfully, he never had to use any of them. He was a vital and often unsung hero of the mission. He kept a perfect vigil, waiting for his crewmate to return from the surface. After a much-needed, though reportedly very cold sleep period inside the Eagle, it was time for Armstrong and Aldrin to leave. They prepared for the most critical moment of the mission after the landing, the ascent. To save weight for the journey home, they threw everything they didn't need out onto the lunar surface. This included their life support backpacks, their boots, and even bags of human waste.
Before they could lift off, the crew ran into one last, potentially mission-ending problem. At some point, while moving around in their bulky suits inside the cramped cabin, one of the astronauts had accidentally bumped into and broken off a crucial circuit breaker switch. And not just any switch. It was the switch that armed the main engine for ascent, the engine they needed to get off the Moon. Without it, they were stranded. The switch was broken in such a way that they couldn't just flick it with their finger. Back in Houston, engineers frantically worked on a solution, but it was Buzz Aldrin who came up with a brilliantly simple, low-tech fix. He realized that a felt-tip pen from their toolkit was non-conductive and just the right size. When the time came, he calmly pushed the pen into the hole where the switch had been, closing the circuit. It worked perfectly. A mission worth billions of dollars, and the lives of the crew were saved, in part by an ordinary pen. With that crisis averted, the countdown for ascent began. The descent stage of the Eagle, the part with the landing legs, would serve as a launch pad for the upper ascent stage. As the engine fired, a camera that had been placed on the surface captured the moment. The footage shows the Eagle's ascent stage lifting off smoothly, surrounded by a spray of insulation foil from the lander. The video also shows the American flag they had planted being violently knocked over by the blast from the rocket engine. It has likely been lying in the lunar dust ever since. Now began a critical orbital chase. Armstrong and Aldrin were in their own tiny spacecraft orbiting the Moon, while Michael Collins was in another, and they had to find each other and link up. Collins, from his vantage point in Columbia, spotted the Eagle coming up from below, later describing it as a beautiful sight. After a carefully choreographed series of engine burns and maneuvers over several hours, the two spacecraft finally docked together with a gentle bump high above the lunar surface.
Before they could lift off, the crew ran into one last, potentially mission-ending problem. At some point, while moving around in their bulky suits inside the cramped cabin, one of the astronauts had accidentally bumped into and broken off a crucial circuit breaker switch. And not just any switch, it was the switch that armed the main engine for ascent. With the docking complete, the crew, along with their precious cargo of moon rocks and film, were finally reunited inside the command module. They had done it.
They had left the moon. They no longer needed the Eagle, so after transferring everything they needed, the lunar module was sealed off and jettisoned. It was sent into a decaying orbit that would eventually send it crashing back down onto the lunar surface. It had served its purpose perfectly. The 3 astronauts were now together in Columbia, their home for the 3-day journey back to Earth. They fired their main engine one last time to push them out of lunar orbit and set them on a course for home. The journey back was similar to the trip out, a long, quiet coast through the vastness of space. It gave the crew time to rest, reflect, and try to put into words the incredible experience they had just been through. They held a final television broadcast, showing the viewers back on Earth stunning views of both the moon receding behind them and the Earth growing ever larger in their window. They spoke of the immense satisfaction and the profound perspective the journey had given them. As they approached Earth, they separated from the service module, the large cylindrical part of the spacecraft that housed their engine and life support systems. Only the cone-shaped command module, protected by its heat shield, would make the final descent. They hit the top of Earth's atmosphere, traveling at a blistering speed of nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, or about 25,000 miles per hour. As the capsule plowed into the air, the compression and friction created a fireball outside their windows. The heat shield on the bottom of the capsule reached temperatures of over 2,700 degrees Celsius, hotter than molten lava, glowing brilliantly as it protected the crew inside.
During this fiery re-entry, the superheated ionized air around the capsule formed a sheath that blocked all radio signals, leading to a tense 3-minute period of communications blackout. The whole world waited in silence for them to emerge from the flames. Once they were through the worst of it, a series of small parachutes deployed to stabilize the capsule, followed by 3 enormous, iconic red and white main parachutes that slowed their descent for a gentle splashdown. On July 24, 1969, 8 days after they had left, the crew of Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, right on target, just a few miles from the recovery ship, the USS Hornet. But the mission wasn't quite over. Even after being recovered from the ocean, the astronauts couldn't just get a handshake and a hero's welcome. They had to be placed into quarantine. This was a serious concern at the time. No one knew for sure if there might be dangerous, unknown microorganisms on the moon germs that could cause a plague back on Earth. So extreme precautions were taken. A recovery diver passed them special biological isolation garments while they were still in the capsule. After being brought aboard the ship, they were immediately ushered into a specially designed trailer called the Mobile Quarantine Facility. They would have to spend 21 days in quarantine just to be safe. Their first interactions with President Nixon and others were through a window on the side of their sealed trailer. It must have been a strange, anticlimactic experience to travel 250,000 miles to the moon and back, only to be confined to a small room for 3 weeks. Of course, scientists soon determined that the moon was sterile, and this intense quarantine procedure was dropped for the later Apollo missions.
Once they were finally released from quarantine, the astronauts were instant global heroes. They embarked on a whirlwind, giant leap goodwill tour, visiting countries all around the world, where they were met by cheering crowds of millions. But the real, lasting legacy of their mission was just beginning to be understood back in the labs.
The 21.5 kilograms of moon rocks they brought back were a scientific treasure beyond compare. These weren't just souvenirs. They were pieces of another world, perfectly preserved in a vacuum for billions of years. Scientists all over the globe eagerly awaited their samples. What they discovered completely rewrote our understanding of the moon. The rocks showed that the moon was not some primordial object captured by Earth, but was made of similar material to Earth's own crust and mantle. This lent huge support to the giant impact hypothesis, the idea that the moon was born from a collision. The rocks also allowed us to accurately date the different regions of the moon, giving us a timeline for the heavy bombardment that characterized the early solar system. Beyond the geology, the Apollo program had a massive, though sometimes hard to quantify, effect on technology back here on Earth. The need to solve incredibly complex problems with the technology of the 1960s spurred innovation across dozens of industries. This Apollo effect gave us huge advancements in computing and software engineering, as we saw with the Apollo guidance computer. It led to the development of new materials, new fabrication techniques, and even new medical monitoring equipment, as doctors needed ways to track the astronauts' health from 250,000 miles away. And it gave us many everyday products, from cordless power tools developed for drilling on the moon to freeze-dried food.
Of course, no discussion of the moon landing would be complete without gently addressing the strange and persistent idea that it was all a hoax. For decades, a small but vocal group of people have claimed the landings were faked, staged in a movie studio to win the space race. They point to things like the waving flag, the lack of stars in the photos, or the strange-looking shadows as proof. However, each of these claims has a very simple and logical explanation. The flag waved because it was mounted on a horizontal rod to make it visible, and it rippled as the astronauts wrestled it into the ground, its movement quickly dampened in the vacuum. There are no stars in the photos, for the same reason you don't see stars in a photo taken of a friend in a brightly lit stadium at night. The lunar surface was brightly lit by the sun, so the camera's exposure was set too short and its aperture too small to capture the faint light of distant stars. And the shadows look strange because the lunar surface is not a flat studio floor. It's bumpy and uneven, which distorts shadows, and there were multiple light sources: the sun, light reflecting off the Earth, and even light bouncing off the lunar surface itself. But the single greatest proof that we went to the moon is something we've already talked about: the laser-ranging retroreflector. That mirror is still up there, exactly where Armstrong and Aldrin left it, and observatories on Earth, to this day, bounce lasers off it to measure the moon's distance. It's an experiment that simply wouldn't work if the mirror wasn't there. The moon landing was real. It was an achievement not of Hollywood, but of hundreds of thousands of dedicated people. Ultimately, the most powerful legacy of Apollo 11 wasn't in the rocks or the technology, but in the inspiration it provided. It was a moment in time when the world seemed to hold its breath and watch together, united in awe. For a brief period, people weren't focused on their differences, but on a shared human achievement. The plaque that the astronauts left on the leg of the lunar lander says it all. It reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD,
we came in peace for all mankind. The mission expanded our sense of what was possible. It showed that with enough ingenuity, dedication, and courage, even the most audacious dreams could be realized. It inspired a generation of scientists, engineers, and dreamers. It gave us a new perspective on our own planet, that beautiful, fragile blue marble hanging in the void, a single shared home for all of us. And so, our quiet journey to the moon and back comes to an end. It's a story of incredible machines, of meticulous planning, and of 3 men who flew a tiny capsule through the darkness. But more than that, it's a story about human curiosity, about our innate desire to explore, to see what's over the next hill, even if that hill is on another world. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest leaps forward are taken one small, quiet step at a time. So, as you drift off, think of that silent grey landscape and the footprints that are still there, perfectly preserved in the dust, waiting for our return. Sweet dreams.